Okay, how are you? How's everyone? Good. See, we're just like on Zoom. We don't even say good, and we just give the thumbs up, right? our the world between the virtual and the real is blurring over time. So, all right. I did get all of your reading or your writing assignments or your reflections on the readings. For the most part, they were pretty good. A couple of you didn't do quite the right things, and so I didn't really, I didn't send to most of you, I didn't send any comments back. And if I didn't send any comments, that basically means it looks good, right? If I did send some comments back, that meant that, I thought there were some things that you could do better. Basically for this first one, if you turned it in, I gave you credit, right? As we get going, I will read, I'm not gonna read all of them super carefully, quite honestly. But occasionally I will be reading them carefully, and I'll be giving you more substantive feedback on them, and also kind of a more detailed grade, right, on it. So I won't do that for all of them, right, but I will do that for some of them. And so, as I said, I think for the most part, though, they look pretty good, and some of yours actually look really good, right? And so I appreciated all the hard work that you put into it, and hopefully that will kind of pay off here, right? As we go forward and we talk about this stuff, I think particularly, reading The Economist magazine, you'll see that I send you a ton of stuff from The Economist. But in many ways, I kind of think about this class as like preparing you to be able to read The Economist magazine or the Wall Street Journal, right? To get enough background so that you are prepared to read these things, because really, if you go work in the financial industry or business or whatever, you really have to be able to read these things, right? You really have to be able to read these things and be able to pick up not just kind of the big picture, but kind of the substantive details, right? And to understand the little things. And so, giving you these kind of articles and getting you some practice of reading them, and hopefully seeing the connections between the text and these articles will help you get a fuller understanding of what's going on. And, like I said, hopefully prepare you for the next step, right? To be prepared when in the future, you don't have a college professor telling you, this is what the article means. You have to read it yourself, and you have to figure out what's the application of this, right? And how does this fit into whatever you're doing for whatever company you're doing. So anyway, good. And, as I said, most days, not all days, but most days you can expect to have one of those little writing assignments. Many days it won't have as many articles to read. So, I don't think it will probably take you quite as long as last night's did. But yeah, you can expect that for most nights, okay? All right, so today we want to talk about credit rationing, right, from the reading that I gave you. And then we want to talk about chapter 3, right, which is money, right, and what money is. Of course, it's important to understand what money is if you want to understand what finance is, because as we said, finance is trading money across time with conditions. So we'll talk a little bit about money in chapter 3, and then this afternoon we might go forward and begin talking about chapter 4, right? Get a little ahead of the game, because if you remember, and we'll talk more about this afternoon, but I have a medical thing tomorrow, and so we will not have class tomorrow morning, okay? And so I'll give you some things to do in lieu of class. I'm somewhat hopeful that we can have class in the afternoon, at least online through Zoom, but it's a oral thing, and so they're probably going to numb my whole head up pretty good. So I don't really know if I'll be able to speak or whatever tomorrow afternoon. So anyway, it might make some sense for us to get a little bit ahead of the game this afternoon. That's probably what we'll begin to do. So, okay, so let's first talk about credit rationing. Yao Ming, I'm sorry that I'm using this green marker. I somehow forgot to get any other color. I only have like red, and all my other markers are dead. So I only have red and green markers. It's like Christmas morning up here. But can you read that green marker very well? Yeah, kind of. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll do the best that we can. Actually, maybe the red one even works a little bit better. We'll see. We'll see. So credit rationing. Okay, credit rationing is related to this idea that we talked about yesterday with asymmetric information. Okay. And what was it that we talked about with regard to asymmetric information? What do we mean by asymmetric information? Garrett.
The information that is available to the lender is different than the information that is available to the borrower.
Right, and specifically it's worse, right? The information that's available to the borrower is worse, to the lender is worse than it is for the borrower, right? And so there's this information advantage that borrowers have. Now, this creates two problems. The first is adverse selection. And adverse selection takes place before the loan is even given out. All right, before the loan is even given out, we have this problem with adverse selection. Okay, so it sounds strange, but who would a bank prefer to lend to? The next person that comes in their door or an average person on the street? The average person on the street, a bank would prefer to lend to than the next person that comes in their door. Why?
The average person is going to be overzealous in their borrowing the way that some people are that would actually seek out loans.
Right. If you need a loan, that probably, it might tell you something about the person, right? I mean, who's more likely to need a loan? Somebody with a gambling problem or somebody without a gambling problem, right? Who's more likely to need a loan? A bad business or a good business? Probably a bad one, right? Now, it's not definitive, right? That's not to say that everybody that comes into a bank is a bad bet. But if you're thinking about probabilities, that probability skews toward the negative if you choose to walk into a bank, right? And so banks know this, right? Banks know that riskier borrowers are more likely to seek loans. That on average, it's riskier borrowers who are more likely to seek loans. This actually goes back to an idea that's won a Nobel Prize in economics. Actually, the name of the paper was The Market for Lemons. Okay, and this paper is actually a paper by George Stiglitz. And when he was in graduate school, he bought a used car, and it was a piece of crap. And he thought, why would anybody buy a used car? Why did I do that? Because what's true about a used car? What could be true? Well, the person who had it sold it. Maybe they know something about the car that I didn't, right? They had this problem of asymmetric information. And so Stiglitz said, boy, isn't that true for all used cars? Isn't buying a used car a bad idea? Because the seller has better information than I do, and that creates a disadvantage for me. Now, as we're going to talk about, there's ways to get around this, right? There's ways to alleviate this. Just like in the market for used cars, there's ways to get around that. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? It's an absolute real phenomena. Banks know this. Banks know that they have to be extra skeptical about people who come into the bank looking for loans. They have to be skeptical of their customers, basically. Adverse selection takes place even before they give a loan, and then there's the problem of moral hazard. There are very few phrases that we will say more this block than moral hazard. Moral hazard, moral hazard, moral hazard. If you want to understand how financial systems work, you have to understand this problem of moral hazard. And it once again ties to asymmetric information. What's the problem? Once you give somebody a loan, they now have your money. So if they lose your money, who's stuck with the costs? You are, right? But if they score big with the money, who gets to keep all the benefits? They do. And that creates an incentive to engage in riskier behavior, right? Whenever you share the downside, whenever you have a situation where you share the downside but you keep the upside, it encourages riskier behavior. Whenever you share the downside but you keep the upside, it encourages riskier behavior. Okay? Because it's not all your money that's at risk. Moral hazard is ubiquitous in life, right? We don't often recognize it, but it is. Every time I see the X Games, I think moral hazard, right? When I see people ski jumping or, skateboarding, I think, would they be doing this if they didn't have health insurance? If they couldn't share the costs of them breaking their neck with other people, would they do it? Right? That's moral hazard, right? People engage in riskier behavior when they can share some of the downside costs, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have health insurance, but I am saying health insurance encourages you to do riskier things. It just does. And the same thing happens in finance, right? When I borrow your money, now I have an incentive to do something riskier with it. Because if I score big, I keep all the upside. But what happens if I blow it? I share some of the downside with you, right? That encourages riskier behavior. Now, moral hazard, as I said, we're going to talk about this 1,000 times this block because every financial transaction probably has a problem with moral hazard in it because what are you always doing? You're trading money now for money later. I'm using your money now. That's usually what happens in finance. So almost in every financial transaction, you have this problem of moral hazard. You have somebody else's money. So, if you think about a bank, banks are both the victim of moral hazard because they lend money out, but of course banks borrow money. So they can also be the perpetrators of moral hazard, right? Banks are both victims and perpetrators. And really that's how financial systems work, right? You can both be the victim of moral hazard, but also you can be the cause of moral hazard, right? And so, as I said, we will keep on talking about this again and again and again, because if you don't understand risk, you don't understand finance. And one of the crucial aspects of risk is understanding adverse selection and moral hazard, right? So if you put these two things together, what do they add up to? Should banks be very open to lending money? No. Strangely enough, while it's their job, banks should be very, very cautious about lending money. And in fact, what banks should do is they should credit ration, right? They should engage in something called credit rationing. This has to do with a paper that won a Nobel Prize as well. I think it was 1986, Stiglitz and Weitz. And Stiglitz and Weitz basically thought about this problem. And they said that adverse selection and moral hazard are what we as economists know as negative externalities. They're negative externalities. They're a negative cost associated with every transaction. So let's think about a market for lending, okay? Let's think about a market for lending. Okay, this is obviously a huge generalization here, but let's just assume we had one big market where people went to borrow money, to get credit, okay? And so we're just going to use some simple application of supply and demand here. Let's say here's the quantity of credit, and here's the interest rate, or the price I pay for credit. And there's just a big supply of credit, and there's a demand for credit. Okay? So just simple application of supply and demand, right? There's money out there. The supply of credit, you could think about this as savings, right? Savings, or this is the amount of lending that could take place. And then here's the amount of borrowing. The demand for borrowing. And notice that the demand for borrowing goes down as the interest rate goes up. And the supply of savings goes up as the interest rate goes up. Right? That makes sense. So just simple supply and demand stuff here. Now, here's what Stiglitz and Weitz figure out. Would a bank in their right mind ever charge an interest rate that clears the market, that sets supply equal to demand? No. And why is that, Natalie?
It wouldn't be cost effective.
It wouldn't be, right, because what cost is this ignoring?
External.
Right, it's ignoring the externalities associated with adverse selection and moral hazard, right? And so what Stiglitz and Weitz say is, and this sounds counterintuitive, right? And that's one of the reasons why this got a Nobel Prize, is it does sound counterintuitive. What do banks actually want to do? Raise interest rates? No. Banks want to lower interest rates. Banks actually want to keep interest rates lower than what would clear the market. Why? Right, it creates excess supply, right? Or excess demand. Here's the demand for credit. Here's the supply of credit, right? What do we have here? We have a situation of excess demand, but this is what banks like. Because what does excess demand mean? Garrett.
With an excess of demand, banks can be more choosy if they lend out money.
Exactly. That's the key word. Banks can be choosy. So when they lower the interest rates, now banks can not lend to everybody. They can pick and choose better who they're going to lend to. They can be pickier. And they can choose not to lend to certain people that look to be more of a credit risk. You don't have to be in finance to kind of figure out who these people are likely to be. Who's most likely to be credit rationed? Who is this? Penny, who's most likely to be credit rationed, do you think? Who's most likely to be told no?
Lower.
Right. Right, low income, who else?
People with lower credit score.
Right. Let's say less info. Who's likely to have less information? Less credit scores and things like that. Younger. Right. People that may not have been in the financial system. So there's some evidence that this is females are more likely to be credit rationed than men because men have an easier time establishing a credit ranking. Minorities are more likely to be credit rationed because, once again, by being excluded from the financial system, you're much less likely to accumulate information that allows you to get that credit score to, get information or to get a loan. Newer firms, small firms, listen, one of the things that the whole financial industry has struggled with in COVID here is what firms have been most vulnerable during COVID. Exactly the kind of firms that are most likely to be credit rationed, right? Because they tend to be restaurants, small businesses. These are the things that are exactly most likely to be credit rationed. So they probably had a hard time getting credit before COVID. Now that COVID hits, it becomes even harder for them to get finance, right? It becomes even harder for them to get finance. And this is one of the things that the Fed and some policymakers have really struggled with, right? What can we do to try to get these firms that were probably already credit rationed more finance because they need it, right? They need it during these tough times. You can kind of see that this is a vicious cycle, right? In the sense that those firms that need it the most have the hardest time getting it. I will undoubtedly say this many times this block, but there is one adage in finance that is always true. Those that have money can get money, and those who don't have money have a hard time getting it, right? If you have money, it's easy to borrow. And if you don't have money, it's hard to borrow. And so, of course, what does that mean? The people who need it most have the hardest time getting it. And that's credit rationing. And credit rationing works in a vicious cycle, right? That the more vulnerable you are, the harder it is to get financed. That just makes you more vulnerable, right? So this is a huge trap, right? This is a huge trap in financial systems, is that we know that finance is crucially important to development, but as a practical matter, it's really hard to get it, right? It is really hard to get it. So what do we do? How do borrowers and lenders and the financial system itself, how do we overcome credit rationing? How do we overcome that? Colton, what's a way that we overcome credit rationing?
Well, like we said the other day, go to other people who lend money, I guess. That wouldn't overcome it. That'd be like a substitution.
Yeah, that's, yeah, it's more of a substitution. It's not going to allow us to overcome it. What do you think, Becca? What do you think?
Legislation, development.
Like, what kind of things? Can we be more specific?
Maybe a certain percentage of their loans has to go to like a certain type of person that's more risky. On this or certain businesses.
Yeah, well, you could. I think there's some much more fundamental things that you can do. Much more fundamental than that. Gary.
Diversify the risk.
Maybe, but there's, once again, I think some very fundamental things that are from your reading.
Just like adding a person.
Sure. So there, sometimes you can do things like that, right? You can have cosigners, but there's something much more common than a cosigner. How do you give the bank some assurance that they're going to get their money back?
Collateral.
Collateral. Right? Collateral. Collateral is huge. Of course, the thing about collateral is collateral requires legal systems. All right? Collateral is more than just having valuable things. You have to have legal systems that allow you to enforce contracts. And you also have to have legal systems that create legal title, right? That create legal title. So one of the things that was talked about in your reading was this work by Hernando de Soto, right? And Hernando de Soto is a Latin American economist, grew up in Bolivia. One of the things that he observed is that one of the things that was a huge impediment to development in Bolivia was the fact that most people only lived on their land, but it was informal land. It wasn't legally held. And so a lot of this is just historical, right? If you go back to the colonial era, right, a lot of land was held in these big haciendas, right, kind of big collectives that were owned by a small group of Europeans. As the hacienda system kind of broke down and these countries became independent, you had a lot of people who were working on the haciendas who just continued to live there, right? And so they were essentially squatters. But the squatters, these countries never developed ways by which squatters could legally obtain the land that they were living on, right? It's a big difference between South America and North America, right? If any of you are familiar with kind of the economic history of the West, the economic history of the West was basically one where squatters had tons of rights, right? If you lived on land and you lived on it long enough, it basically became yours, right? You could get legal title to it. So, but that was not the system that's set up in most of the part of the world. And so what you have is you have people who are living on land that they don't formally own. Why does that create a problem? Because they don't legally own it. They can't use it as collateral to get a loan. They don't have the same incentive to improve the land, to build on it, because they don't own it, right? They don't own it. And so, you know, the lack of a kind of functioning legal system, right? And here, not just a legal system in terms of, you know, crime, but a legal system in terms of property rights is one of the things that really keeps some financial systems backwards, right? Developing legal property rights. And title is absolutely crucial to overcoming these problems of credit rationing. What are some other things? Rose, you remember anything from the reading we talked about? Everybody, we caught in the readings, there were 8, 10 things that were talked about to overcome credit rationing. What's one of the most important? What's one of the first things that happens if you go and get a loan? What is the first thing the bank does? They examine your credit history, right? Where does your credit history come from? It doesn't just happen by accident, right? There's a whole system of information reporting, right? The government and private organizations collect information on you. And so that's a huge part. The government requires certain information to be reported. And then these credit bureaus or credit organizations collect this information and make it readily available. Right? So some of this comes from reporting, meaning the government required. Right? The government requires certain information to be reported, but then some of this is by the private sector. Right? The private sector, so companies actually have created businesses by which they collect this information and make it available. Right? So that's obviously a huge way that you overcome credit rationing, right? Try to get better information, right? Try to get better information. In general, who has better information on a borrower? Financial markets or banks? For most borrowers, remember who are most borrowers? Most borrowers are just average people. Financial markets have good information on average people. If I want to buy a house here in Mount Vernon, do you think financial markets have good information on what the property market in Mount Vernon looks like? No. What Cornell College looks like? No. Who's much more likely to have better information on that? Hills Bank, right? And that is one of the reasons why banks exist. Banks, financial intermediaries tend to have better information. What do we see in poor countries? The poorer the country is, usually the more important banks are. Right? In many countries, 90% of the finance is done by banks. In the United States, it's only about 30%. Why are banks so important in poor countries? This is one of the big reasons, right? Is that banks tend to have better information, particularly in environments where information is not readily available, right? So, I don't know if any of you grew up in a small town. I did. We had a kind of a local bank, right? It was cleverly called National Bank, right? So one of the things that I knew about the president of the bank was he was in the Rotary Club. He taught Pee Wee baseball. His kids went to public school. He played golf on the weekends. He went to church. And that was pretty common, right? And I think that's still relatively common among small community banks. Is that because bankers are just naturally community-minded people? Maybe, but I think there's something deeper going on there, right? That usually where banks have comparative advantage is we're having better information. They know their borrowers, right? They know the people who borrow from them. And so Mount Vernon Savings and Loan, I can tell you this 100%, right? This is where they do their business, right? A number of the people who went there grew up around here. They went to Cornell College. They know people in the community. When they go in for a loan, or when I go for a loan, they're like, hey, I know that guy. He's going to pay his money back, right? Or they see somebody else like, I don't know. There's this story about this, right? And that is valuable information, right? And that's really one of the big reasons why banks exist, right? Is that they do tend to have better information, right? Because they tend to work with smaller borrowers and smaller lenders, right? And in the process, they get better information. A few other things that banks and financial systems often do to try to minimize the problem of credit rationing. One is they tend to prefer short-term loans instead of long-term loans. Why? You can keep better track on somebody, right? What's going to encourage more moral hazard? Give them a loan for 20 years or give them a loan for 6 months? A loan for 6 months, right? It's gonna require you to kind of check in with me more, right? Many times banks will have what are called restrictive covenants. In their loans. And restrictive covenants are basically restrictions on what you can do. Right, restrictive covenants. So the bank might say, yeah, we'll give you a loan, but you cannot get a loan from anybody else at the same time, right? Or you cannot engage in this kind of behavior, right? Or you can't do this. And what they're trying to do is basically limit your ability to engage in other riskier behavior, right? The last thing I'll say, and in many ways this is the most important, though it's the one that's the hardest to kind of figure out where exactly it comes from, is to develop societies that have trust. Trust is one of these things where it sounds kind of touchy-feely, like why are we talking about it in an economics class? But it is undoubtedly very, very important in how markets work, right? I mean, markets rely upon a huge sense of trust, right? We spend tons of time buying things from people that we have never met and we never will meet. Why do we do it? Well, we have some sense of trust, right? The economist Kenneth Arrow, won a Nobel Prize, said, it can plausibly be argued that much of economic backwardness in the world can be explained by the lack of mutual confidence, right? Adam Smith, right? Before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he was a philosopher. He wrote a book on trust. And he said one of the advantages of markets is that markets ask you to trust people you've never met before. And building a sense of trust is one of the things that builds society, right? And so, what trust does is it minimizes the us versus them thinking, and it gives people more confidence and less risk that when people say they're going to do something, they do it. So you can think about trust as basically a way of reducing transaction costs. It's a way to make trade easier when you have trust. And there have been lots of studies that have shown there are a few ways of measuring trust. One way of measuring trust, which was kind of clever, was some economists just took wallets and put $100 in them, and then some information about where the wallet could be returned, and just spread them all over subways across the world. And you won't be surprised to find out that in some countries, huge fractions of those wallets were returned. And in other countries, huge fractions of those wallets were not returned, right? And you can actually correlate that with the level of economic development in these countries, right? What was it like in Scandinavia? I think like 98% of the wallets were returned, right? In Venezuela, none of them were. That's not really very surprising, right? It's not very surprising. And so, you know, this idea of mutual confidence, right, is huge. And so oftentimes this builds over time, right? You have a financial system that encourages you to work with people you don't know, that builds trust, that then encourages more financial development, which builds trust in kind of a virtuous circle. But then sometimes you get the vicious cycle, right? Where trust collapses, so people don't deal with people that they're not used to, so they become more skeptical, so you get less trust, less trade, back and forth, right? And so, yeah, you know, trust is feels a little touchy-feely, right? Like, you know, how in the world do you develop it? But I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that wherever trust comes from is very important. Very important. There is a role of government in regulating financial systems, right? And so let's talk about this very briefly before we move on to chapter 3. Okay. First off, some of the stupidest things I've ever heard related to finance is this idea that, well, we should just let the market decide. Why is government even involved in regulating financial transactions? Just let the market, right? Let the market decide. Why is the government getting involved? People who say that don't really understand anything about finance, quite honestly, right? Financial transactions are not perfectly competitive. This is not a perfectly competitive market, right? It's just not. Financial markets are not perfectly competitive. Why? Because of imperfect information. And its sister problem, asymmetric information. These things lead to market failures, right? So whenever you say somebody like, oh, we should get the government out of the financial system, I always want to say, well, yeah, go down and do your finance in Haiti, right? Haiti's government is not highly involved in their financial system. Go down and try to get a loan in Haiti. See how that works for you, right? It's not going to work, right? It doesn't work. The free market, the Wild West, is not a conducive area for finance, right? So finance is one of the regions of the economy where I would say all rational people realize that government has a role to play, right? Government has a role to play. In our system, financial regulation really takes place in two different ways, right? There's kind of two primary aims. The first is trying to increase information. Trying to increase information to everyone. So this is information reporting, regulations, right? Every financial institution, every type of financial institution has requirements on information that they have to report. And this is really the purpose of the Securities and Exchange Commission, right? The Securities and Exchange Commission is basically that agency that's tasked with making sure that financial institutions are following the disclosure standards that they are regulated to follow. What are these standards? Well, they are following, there are things such as following GAAP accounting procedures, right? They are providing appropriate information on cash flows and balance sheets and other information, right? That the SEC, Congress, and the president have decided is useful information for all people, right? The key to this is this information has to be available to everyone, right? It is not legal to trade on information that is not available to everyone. That's what insider trading is, right? And if you don't think that people can get in trouble with this, talk to Martha Stewart, right? You cannot trade on information that is not available to everyone. And so much of what the SEC does is follow leads, right? And if they can determine that you traded on information that was not publicly available, you can go to jail for that, right? You can go to jail for that. That is insider trading and illegal. So this really applies to everybody, right? Everybody that's in the financial system has to be making sure that for the people who are issuing securities, right, or borrowing, they have to make all information available. And for the people who are lending, they have to make sure that they're lending based only on public information, right? Only on public information. This is really the only kind of regulation that applies to bonds and stocks. This is really the only kind of regulation that applies to bonds and stocks. Other than that, it's buyer beware. So if you own a share of stock and the company goes bankrupt and the price of that stock tanks to zero, can you sue the company? Not unless you can prove that they withheld information. If you can prove that they withheld information, then yeah, you can sue the board of directors and you can sue the CEO and you can do that. But if they were just incompetent, no, you can't. And so, once again, it really comes down to information, right? As long as the information out there was accurate, reasonably accurate, right? And as long as it was publicly available, after that, it's buyer beware. The second aim doesn't apply to bonds and stocks, but it does apply to banks. And it is banks that are much, much more tightly regulated, right? Ensuring the soundness of financial intermediaries. All financial intermediaries, but particularly banks, right? Banks are amongst the most tightly regulated companies in the United States, and for good reason, right? Banks, right? It's been determined that the soundness of banks, right? The fact that banks don't crash on us and blow all of our money is a public good. And so it's in the interest of the government to try to ensure this, right? And so if you ever work at a bank, or if any of you worked in a bank, one of the things you'll see is that banks are tightly regulated, right? There's a lot of things that banks have to pay attention to. There's regulations on right? There's regulations on, oops, not how can own a bank, who can own a bank. There's information reporting. There are loan safety standards. Can banks just lend to whoever they want? No, they have to go through procedures to make sure that the loans have an appropriate amount of safety to them. They have to purchase deposit insurance, through the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So the government provides banks with deposit insurance, but banks have to pay for that. Banks have to hold a required reserve ratio. You might remember this from principles, but it's the percent of deposits that have to be held by the bank that they can't lend out. Banks have capital requirements. We will talk about this in great detail, but basically banks cannot have ratios of assets to equity. We'll talk about why this works, why this is important. And then all this stuff holds for foreign banks too. Right? It doesn't make any difference whether you're an American bank or a foreign bank. You have to abide by the same rules. Right? One of the things that we will talk about as we get into banking is we'll talk about this kind of system in more detail, the system of regulation. You know, I have to say, the US banking system is far and away the most unusual in the world, right? It's a very unusual banking system. It's much more complex than what's in most countries. And there's a reason for that, is that this country was really founded on a fear of central banking. One of the things that many of the founding fathers feared was banks, and banks getting too much power. And so our banking system was purposely set up to be very, very disjoint and spread out and small. And also the way that we regulate banks have traditionally been that way too, where banks have been regulated, some banks by the federal government, some by state governments, right? We've had a long history, not anymore, but a long history until the last 30 or 40 years of having primarily state banks, right? That were operated state by state, banks that could not operate outside of a single state. So the banks in Iowa could only operate in Iowa, right? You don't remember this, but it wasn't that long ago. Basically, it was 1980 when this began to change. So, you know, we have a very convoluted system. But one of the things we'll talk about is while we have this very convoluted system, there is this trend toward a lot more centralization, right? Much bigger banks now in the United States than we've ever had in past history. And also regulation has been much more centralized, right? After 2008 financial crisis, we'll talk about the Frank-Dodd Financial Reform Act. But the Frank-Dodd Financial Reform Act now has put the Fed is the primary regulator, or what they call the systematic. So there's other regulatory agencies in the US, but who's at the top of that heap? The Fed. And that's only been since 2010. So this is a recent development. It's one that I will argue is a good development. And if you don't think it's a good development, look how much better our financial system has performed during this COVID crisis than it did in 2008, right? I think we have a much more stable system nowadays, but it's still pretty convoluted, right? As we'll see, it's still fairly convoluted relative to what we see in other countries. So that kind of takes us through chapter 2, right? Which all of that we could broadly call introductory stuff. Right? Some basic kind of big overview of the US financial system, right? And so now what we want to do is kind of talk about some of the details and all of that. And we will begin by talking about money, which seems like a good place to start because finance is about trading money. So we better have a pretty clear idea about what do we mean when we talk about money, when we talk about finance. Okay, so the first thing to note is that when we use money in an economics class, we have a specific definition, right? That in everyday lingo, we oftentimes will use income to mean the same as money, or wealth to be the same as money, right? So we kind of use money very loosely in everyday life. But, we might say, that guy's got a lot of money. You may not have any money. You might be wealthy. You can be wealthy, but have no money, right? So what is money? What is money?
Medium of exchange.
Medium of exchange, right? It's anything that is generally accepted in payment, right? Anything that is generally accepted in payment. And of course, this has got some wiggle room in it, right? Generally accepted is I think that can often be up for debate, as we will talk about. So clearly, currency is money, right? But is Bitcoin money? Well, as we'll see, at least the Federal Reserve doesn't consider it money, right? The Federal Reserve doesn't consider it to be generally accepted in trade. But, I think, so the generally is an accepted word, but, the anything is a really important word too, right? Oftentimes we tend to get bogged down into thinking that money is just currency, but that's not true. It's not true historically, where we've seen all sorts of things serve as money. And I think as the readings that I gave you indicate, it's not going to be true in the future, right? Where things, the type of things that serve as money is going to look a lot different in the future than it does right now. It already does, right? One of the things we'll talk about is when it comes to things like electronic money, the US is way behind the curve, right? Way behind the curve. I mean, we are like in the dark ages compared to where some other countries are in terms of electronic money, right? I went to China in December, and I don't think I touched one the entire time, right? The idea of having paper money is really kind of moved on, right? Everybody paid with everything on their phones, right? It was all electronic money. So, yeah, I think in this, being Americans, we usually like to think of ourselves as ahead of the curve, but we are really pretty far behind the curve, right, relative to where a lot of the rest of the world is. Why do we need money? Why does money always come up? Where would we be in a world without money? What do you think, Gary?
Money is important because in a barter economy, double coincidence.
Right, the double coincidence of wants, right? So in a barter economy, you have to have what they want, they have to have what you want. That makes it a real pain to trade, right? So if you have a sweater and you want to go buy a goat, right, you have to find not only somebody that has a goat, but they also have to want your sweater. So the nice thing about money is you can break that one transaction into two simpler transactions, right? Money just makes things simpler, right? It makes things simpler because of the double coincidence of wants, but it also makes things trade easier in terms of information, right? Why? Because you don't have to understand nearly so many prices, right? If I told you how many, for a nice sweater, how many goats do you think it costs? We have no idea. 2? Where'd you get that? You just mean, right? You don't have any idea. If I told you for a nice sweater, how many dollars does it cost? 40, 50, right? Yeah, that's kind of where my mind jumped to, right? We don't have to memorize so many prices, right? Think about one of the hard things about barter is that you have to memorize a huge number of prices. You know, you don't have nearly as an innate feel for the value of goods because it's just much more complicated. And so money makes that simpler, right? Money has, if you remember the principles, 3 functions. It is a medium of exchange. In other words, it reduces transaction costs. It is a unit of account, meaning it's a way of measuring value. And I mean, this goes back to what I was saying, but this is very, very important, right? Dollars we just kind of have an innate sense of the value of things in terms of dollars because it's a unit of account that we all measure, we all understand, right? If I tell you that my car is worth 4 goats, does that mean much to you? No. If I tell you my car is worth $1,500, does that mean a lot to you? Yeah, you can vision my car, right? It's a piece of crap. And that's one of the big values of money, right? I used to take a class of students to Uruguay in South America. And Uruguay is kind of an interesting place. Uruguay has a local currency, right? The Uruguayan peso. But then a lot of things were also conducted, particularly big transactions were conducted in US dollars. And so, you know, one of the locals there said, you know, it's funny how currency works, that I could not tell you how much a loaf of bread costs in US dollars. And I also couldn't tell you how much a car costs in Uruguayan pesos, right? Because his brain just worked that way, right? The normal everyday stuff was all in pesos. The big ticket price stuff was all in dollars. So his brain had basically kind of divvied that world up, and it was hard to keep it across, right? And, you know, having these measures, these unit of accounts are just very easy ways for us to convey value and convey information, right? It's about conveying information. And then finally, it's a store of value. Because once again, what's the key about finance? Time, right? You're trading money now for money later. So if the money doesn't hold up over time, it's probably not going to be very good money, right? So this is the reason why like raw fish has never been a very popular form of money, right? Because it just doesn't hold up, right? But in prisons, canned fish is a very popular form of money, believe it or not. Right? Canned fish is, you know, it actually serves these 3 things pretty well, right? Canned mackerel in particular. It's a medium of exchange, right? Because as I understand it, I had a friend who spent some time in prison, a good friend. I won't get into that. But, you know, most of the meals there are like, they don't have a lot of protein in it. So having canned fish around, canned mackerel is very popular because, you know, a lot of The guys spend a lot of time weightlifting. It's a unit of count because a can of mackerel costs about $1. So it kind of makes sense to us. And it's a store of value because it lasts forever, right? And so canned mackerel is a very popular form of money in prison. Just like in the reading that you had from the Money in a Prisoner of War, in the old days when you could smoke in prison, what was a common form of money? Cigarettes, right? Cigarettes. And so, yeah, really anything in theory can serve as money, right? As long as it can serve these three functions, right? As long as it can serve these three functions. Now, there are different types of money. Okay. First, traditionally, it's been commodity money. And this is money that has intrinsic value, inherent value. Gold, canned mackerel, cigarettes, right? Because if you don't want to use it as money, what can you do? Use it as something else. You can smoke the cigarette, you can eat the canned mackerel, you can turn the gold into jewelry or whatever. Some of the first commodity money that has ever been discovered is from Mesopotamia, right? We talked about this yesterday, right? Really where finance began. And Mesopotamia, they have these clay tokens that were essentially promissory notes, IOUs, right? And those clay tokens, in some sense, are not that much different than the paper money we pass around today, right? That says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. It said something like that, but in Mesopotamia, right? So all sorts of different things have been used as money over time, right? Butter in Norway, chocolate among the Aztecs, salt, right? This is an little tidbit of information, but the word salary actually denotes from salt, right? Because that was a very common form of payment. Whale's teeth, cowrie shells, right? Lots of different things have been used as money. However, commodity money has a big problem. And this is one of the things you were asking about in your writing, Natalie, but the problem is Gresham's law. Right? And Gresham's law simply says that bad money drives out good. Okay. So let's think to that Money in a Prisoner of War Camp article. What happened to the quality of the money in the war camp over time? Went down. What was driving it down?
They were taking the cigarettes to make it more out of one over.
Right. So they unroll them and take some of the tobacco out and re-roll them, right? And try to turn 10 cigarettes into 12. Or they get different brands, right? And so which brands would get traded? The low quality brands, right? And you smoke the high quality brands yourself. Or you would unroll them and put in pipe tobacco, right? So basically, one of the problems with commodity money is it gets debased over time. And debased means the quality just gets worse and worse and worse. So this is a problem with cigarettes. It's always been a problem with using things like gold coins, right? Because gold coins, you can melt them down, mix them with lower quality metals, remint them, and turn 10 gold coins into 15 goldish coins, right? I'm just full of just like little interesting tidbits, but you ever wonder why the edges of your quarter are serrated? right? Like the edges of nickels and pennies are smooth, but the edges of quarters are serrated. You wanna know why? Because they used to be made out of silver. And so what people would do is they take a knife and you go around the edge and scrape them down. And if you did that to enough quarters, you'd actually have some money, right? And so the serrating was so that you know if anybody scraped your quarters, right? Yeah, you know, so all these little things tend to undermine the confidence and the trust that you have in money. And then the other problem with commodity money is it can just be bulky, right? I mean, it's a pain to carry around gold coins or cigarettes or cowrie shells or whatever. And so over time, countries moved, well, I did, actually, let me walk this out a little bit. Typically, what we did in developed countries is we moved from commodity money to basically backed currency. We moved to backed paper money. So paper money that represented a claim to a certain commodity. Right, and actually, I'll back up here one step. Really, this process began with what were called goldsmiths. And goldsmiths were basically people who held gold. They were the precursors to modern banks. If you had gold and you didn't want it in your house because it was vulnerable, what you could do is you could take your gold to a goldsmith, and what would that person give you? An IOU. And so people would trade those IOUs around. It's essentially like paper money that's backed to gold. And eventually who take over the role of goldsmiths? Governments. And they began to have gold standard, right? The gold standard, which was essentially paper money that represented IOUs to a specific claim for gold. Finally, we moved to fiat money. In fiat money, the word fiat really means king's decree. Right? King's decree. But is that where fiat money really gets its value? From the fact that government says it has value? No, no. I mean, would you take Zimbabwean dollars in your paycheck? Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, money needs to be generally accepted.
It needs, right. The only reason you're going to take US dollars in your paycheck is because you're pretty sure that somebody else is going to take them, right? That's the only reason why we use paper money, is because we have some confidence that other people will take them. The fact that the government requires it is not enough to make it generally accepted, right? And we've seen many examples of this in other countries where the currency gets debased, where the government prints up money like crazy, the value tanks, and what happens? People stop accepting it, right? And the government can say, you must take it, you must take it, you must take it. The fact of the matter is, if people don't think they can spend it, they're not going to take it, right? And so they can go right back to having a barter account, right? Or using something else as money, a commodity money, or maybe some other paper. So yeah, you know, really, where fiat money gets its value from is belief, which is back to this word of trust. Money is a social arrangement that creates networks of ideas and webs of trust. Some people find this so shocking, and I think the reason they find this shocking is that they haven't really stopped to think about the fact that almost everything that we think has value is in some sense because we believe it has value, right? I mean, honestly, why do people, when they get scared, go to gold? What's gold?
It's just the most common precious metal that can be easily.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, it's just yellow rock, right? It's not particularly valuable. It's not like there are certain things that only gold can provide. It's a kind of it's a weak metal. It's kind of pretty, people think, but I mean, that's not, there's not a lot of intrinsic value in gold. Why do we believe it's valuable? Because we believe other people believe it's valuable, right? It's a web of belief, a web of trust, And that's really what is true about all money, whether you're talking about paper money or gold, right? You're really talking about webs of trust. The historian Yuval Harari says, money is the only trust system created by humans that can bridge almost any cultural gap and that does not discriminate on the basis of religion, gender, race, age, or sexual orientation. It is something that we tend to trust, right? We may not be able to trust each other, but when monetary systems work, they tend to be trusted, right? And that was, of course, the point, I won't flash it up here, but the point of that Onion article about Ben Bernanke saying, mistaking or accidentally announcing that money is just a mutually shared illusion and the financial market's panicking, right? It is, right? Whether people realize that or not, it is a mutually shared illusion. But it's an illusion that actually works for the public good, right? Because it allows us to trade easier and trust more, right? And so it's an illusion, but not all illusions are bad, right? Some of them are good, and this is one of the ones that are very, very good. So then this leads us to talking about maybe the next stage, right? Which is electronic money. So when we talk about electronic money, quite honestly, I think there's a lot of confusion about this because saying electronic money really encompasses a whole bunch of different things. And many of these things are not really money, to be honest with you, but it incorporates a lot of different things. It can include things like debit cards, stored value cards, right? You're all familiar with. Those, in theory, could be forms of money, right? And electronic payment systems like, for instance, Venmo. If you're from China, WePay, right? So I think I mentioned to you in China now, I mean, these kind of electronic payment systems are ubiquitous, right? Ubiquitous. Not just in China, but places like Scandinavia, right? I think in Scandinavia, 80 to 90% of transactions are done electronically, right? In China, pretty much anywhere you go, and by anywhere, I mean like even, kind of roadside vendors, right? Informal vendors. They will have one of those little, what's the word I'm thinking? I'm forgetting what you call them. The little, the what? The squares with not the UBC code, but
QR code.
yeah, QR code. Thank you. Right, and so you go in and you get on WeChat, right? And WeChat is a very popular social media, right? WeChat is a little bit like, I guess you think of it as like Facebook and Instagram combined, but a big part of WeChat is WePay, right? That you can pay for things through your WeChat accounts. You can put stored value, kind of like in Venmo. You can put you can link your bank account or some other account or a credit card to your WeChat, and then you just take a picture, and that's how you pay for everything, right? And in fact, most places would prefer you to do it that way because it's cheaper, right? It's cheaper, and you don't have to worry about cash, and you don't have to worry about all the headaches that come along with managing cash. So there's that. And then there's also what your article talked about. I want to get this right. CBDC, right? Central bank digitalized currencies, which is pure electronic currency, currency that cannot be redeemed for paper money. Right? Currency that cannot be redeemed for paper money. And then you have kind of the private decentralized currencies. These are private individuals who are attempting to make digital currencies, such as Bitcoin, Facebook is talking about this now, right? Creating a digital currency that's regulated only by Facebook. And so as your article talked about, one of the reasons why central banks are interested in getting in this is because they don't want to fall behind Bitcoin and Facebook, right? Or Google, right? If some of these private companies begin offering digital currency, they don't want to be left out, right? They don't want to be left out. So central banks are kind of dipping their toe into this, some more than others. The Fed, no. But the Fed doesn't feel the pressure because the US is not nearly as electronic as other countries, right? So the Bank of China feels the pressure to get into central bank digitalized currencies much more than the Fed does, because China is much more reliant on digital money, right? Electronic money. The US less so, though I'm sure that the Fed is thinking about it, right? And dipping their toe in things. Let's kind of talk about maybe the pros of this and the cons of some of these things. Let's maybe talk about the pros first. What are the advantages of electronic monies?
Reduced transaction costs.
Exactly. Why did we move the paper money? To cut transaction costs. Why did we move from paper money to electronic money? To further cut transaction costs, right? I mean, there's no doubt that this is a huge driver. It's really nice to pay with your phone, right? I mean, things like Apple Pay are not really that widely used, but I have to say in China, once you get used to using it, pretty nice. It's pretty nice not to have to be messing around with it. What else? Any other advantages?
Even more direct transaction.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
If I want to target that I gave cash, I'd have to put cash in my account and then take that cash back out to pay for something else.
Mm-hmm.
Or I can just put my card in and I'll go directly to their account and put their card somewhere else.
And that's, of course, one of the reasons why Target wants you to use their credit card is they don't want to have to pay Visa a transaction fee. And so some of these electronic monies, because they're not tied to credit cards, actually can reduce the fees that you pay to credit card companies. What are some of the cons? Well, let me back up by saying one of the things that comes up in this article is that one of the reasons why central banks might want to move to this more is because it allows for better information and tracking, right? The Federal Reserve would love to know where transactions are taking place in the economy so they have better information about the economy. Of course, to some people, that's also the con, right? The privacy. I mean, some people don't want the government to know everything that they're spending. One other pro that was mentioned in this article, a number of you talked about in your summaries, was this deal about negative interest rates. And I'm not sure that some of you completely understood what the article was trying to say here. So let's talk about it, see if we can make it a little bit clearer. Why would a central bank like negative interest rates? Well, think about the situation that we're in right now. Central banks want to stimulate the economy during a downturn, right? So we have this COVID downturn. Central banks want to think they can stimulate the economy by cutting interest rates. But what's the problem? You can cut interest rates all the way down to 0. But in a traditional financial system, you really can't cut interest rates below 0. Because if you have negative interest rates, and by negative interest rates mean you pay to lend money, okay? I know that's backwards. You pay to lend money. In a world of negative interest rates, what would most savers do?
Not safe. They wouldn't save.
Well, they wouldn't save in a bank, right? Where could they get, instead of a negative interest rate, where could they get a 0 interest rate? Just hold cash, right? So just hold cash. You get a 0% interest rate, but that's better than a negative interest rate. So in this world that we live in, it's very hard to have negative interest rates. Central banks can't keep on cutting interest rates. 0 is kind of a floor. But now imagine a world in which there was no physical currency. Now, if the central bank can set interest rates negative, because what are you going to do with electronic currency? You can't pull it out of the financial system. It's stuck there, right? There would be no way for you to trade it and pull it out of the system. It's got to be stuck there. So central banks could lower interest rates even more, right? They could have negative interest rates. Quite honestly, I don't think that this is something that most central banks want to do. I think this is we'll talk about this a little bit later. When we talk about central banking, but it's a pretty drastic situation. It's not a sign of a healthy financial system when you have negative interest rates, right? It's not something that you really want to do all the time, but it might provide some, occasional tool for a central bank to use. What are some of the other reasons why people, why has the US been so slow to move to digital currency?
Security risk.
Security. Real and perceived. And I think in the US, there's a lot of perceived security risk, right? Most studies that I've seen still suggest that physical currency is a much bigger security risk than digital currency, right? But there is a perception, right? There is a perception that digital currency is vulnerable, right? And so I think that definitely does it. What else do you need to have a digital currency? You need the internet, right? You need digital access. And one of the things that we see for the US, and one of the things that really hurts the US, just like in everything else, there's a great deal of inequality when it comes to digital access. I mean, some parts of the United States are top in the world in terms of digital access. Other parts of the US look more like an emerging market economy, right, than a developed country, right? And so if you don't have reliable, high-speed, high data access, right, then it's going to be hard for you to want to move to a digital currency, right? So, you know, in many countries, they have essentially free Wi-Fi all over the place, right? In the US, you know, I would be reluctant to only have digital currency because we have places in the US, in part because of inequality, in part just because we're a big country with kind of some difficult terrains. But there's many parts of the US that you don't have internet access, you don't have cell phone access, right? And so that leaves you vulnerable. Did you have a question? Right.
One of the largest service providers that is like.
Right. And Australia is actually a great example of this because Australia's got some of the most uninhabitable land in the world, right? And yet, by and large, their digital access is much better than the US. So it's not all terrain, right? A lot of it is just politics and inequality, right? So, yeah, you know. And then I think, you know, I'm going to add one other thing here that I think plays into some people's fears, is when you have digital currency, you really need some government input, right? You need government regulation. Governments have to be big parts of this. And so what happens when you have a fraction of your population that doesn't trust the government? You know, it's hard, right? When you say let free markets work, well, once again, free markets are great if your markets are perfectly competitive. But when they're not perfectly competitive, free markets just mean market failure. And so here, I think, is another example of where we largely have some market failure because the government really hasn't been involved enough. It hasn't been involved enough protecting privacy and protecting security, right? I think a lot of reasons why people worry about security and privacy is they don't really think that there's anybody out there watching for their interests. So, okay, I think we've come close to reaching our time limit here. So let's take a break and we'll come back at 12:30. Just a few minutes of finishing up chapter 3. We don't really have much left to talk about there. And then, like I said, I might spend half an hour or 40 minutes kind of getting going on chapter 4, okay? All right, have a good lunch. We'll see you in a couple hours.